On the evening of April 14th, 1865, the Lincoln family sat down to dinner in the White House before heading to Ford's Theater. Within hours, the president would be dead. The meals served that final night have been pieced together from staff letters, kitchen records, and the recollections of White House servants spanning the last weeks of the Civil War. Number 9 on this list was Lincoln's absolute favorite dish, something he requested nearly every week. Number 4 was so rare in April of 1865 that it traveled hundreds of miles, packed in ice. And number 1, the very last thing Lincoln reportedly touched with his fork, changes how you picture that terrible night forever. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button, because you are about to walk through a White House kitchen that no longer exists. Let's count down the 25 foods served the night Lincoln was shot. Number 25. Cornbread sat on the Lincoln family table almost every day, a plain square of golden crumb that carried the president back to his Kentucky boyhood. The White House cook that spring was a woman named Mary Dines, a formerly enslaved cook who had found her way into the executive mansion kitchen through the contraband camps north of the city. She made cornbread the old way, with white cornmeal, buttermilk, a pinch of salt, and pork fat melted in the pan before the batter hit the iron. It baked fast, crisping at the edges, soft at the center. Lincoln would break it with his fingers and eat it while reading telegraphs from Grant. On the night of April 14th, a fresh pan cooled on the kitchen sideboard, cut into generous wedges for supper. It was the humble thing on the table, and almost certainly the first thing he reached for. Number 24. Fresh butter churned that very morning in the White House basement glistened in a small cut-glass dish. The kitchen still kept a small dairy cow on the grounds, a practical holdover from the earlier days of the mansion, and the milk was set overnight in shallow pans to rise. By sunrise on April 14th, a kitchen maid was turning the hand crank of a wooden churn until the butter broke, golden and sweet. She worked it in cold water to rinse the buttermilk out, pressed in a pinch of salt, and shaped it into a rectangle stamped with a small White House seal. That butter softened on the plate beside the cornbread, beside the bread rolls, beside the boiled vegetables. In an age before refrigeration, fresh butter was a small daily miracle, and it was everywhere on the table that night. Number 23. Pickled cucumbers, sharp and tangy, had been put up the previous summer in great earthenware crocks in the White House pantry. Washington summers were brutally hot in 1864, and the kitchen had stocked hundreds of jars of preserved vegetables to carry the household through winter and into spring. Cucumbers were brined with dill, mustard seed, garlic, and a strip of oak leaf for crispness. By mid-April, the pickle barrels were running low, but still full enough to supply the supper table with a small dish of spears and rounds. Lincoln was known to favor pickles with almost every meal. They cut the richness of the fat and salt that defined Civil War-era cooking, and the sharpness woke up a palate tired of boiled meat. The vinegar smell of those pickles would have been the first thing a visitor noticed walking into the dining room. Number 22. Stewed apples, spiced with cinnamon and a little brown sugar, filled a white porcelain bowl near the center of the table. Apples were the one fruit that could carry a household through a Washington winter. The previous October, the kitchen had received crates of firm, tart apples from Maryland and Virginia orchards, most of them wrapped in newspaper and stored in the cool cellar beneath the mansion. By April, the survivors were soft and slightly wrinkled, no longer fit for the fruit bowl but perfect for stewing. A cook would peel and slice them into a heavy copper pan, add water, sugar, and a stick of cinnamon, and let them break down into a sweet amber mush. Lincoln loved apples in every form, raw from his pocket, stewed, baked whole, pressed into cider. That bowl of stewed apples was a reminder of the farm life he had never quite left behind. Number 21. Spring onions, the very first green thing pulled from the White House garden that year, appeared on the supper table, chopped fine over a dish of boiled potatoes. The winter of 1864 to 1865 had been mild, and by early April, the garden beds along the south lawn were already pushing up chives, ramps, and scallions. The gardener, a man named John Watt, who had worked the White House grounds for years, brought a bundle of them up to the kitchen door that morning, roots still damp. For a household that had eaten root vegetables and preserves for 5 straight months, the taste of fresh green onion was a small resurrection. Their sharp bite cut through the heavy meats on the table and marked the first real taste of spring in a city exhausted by war. Number 20. White loaf bread, soft and pillowy, sat in a basket lined with a linen cloth. The White House kitchen baked bread twice a day, using bolted wheat flour imported from mills in Baltimore. Wheat bread in 1865 was still a mild luxury, lighter and more refined than the dark rye and cornbread eaten in most American homes. The loaves were shaped by hand, proofed on a warm bench near the great coal stove, and baked in the brick oven that still stood in the old kitchen wing. By the time the family sat down to supper on April 14th, the bread was just cool enough to slice, the crust crackling under the knife. Lincoln preferred his bread plain, buttered, or dipped into broth. He was not a man who needed fancy food, and a warm slice of fresh white bread was comfort enough. Number 19. Coffee, strong and black, came from beans roasted in small batches in the White House kitchen. Coffee had become deeply political during the Civil War. Union soldiers received a generous ration of it as part of their field supplies, and the smell of brewing coffee was said to define every Union camp, from Washington to Georgia. In the White House, coffee was served at nearly every meal, brewed in a tall tin pot on the back of the stove. Lincoln drank it, but never with the enthusiasm he reserved for sweeter drinks. That evening, the pot sat on the sideboard, kept warm for anyone who wanted a cup before leaving for the theater. The steam rose and mingled with gaslight, and the bitter smell lingered long after the family had left the room. Number 18. Black tea, imported through Boston Harbor from China, sat in a lidded porcelain pot beside the coffee. Tea was Mary Todd Lincoln's preferred drink, and she kept a personal supply of high-quality leaves in a locked caddy in her private sitting room. The war had disrupted many trade routes, but tea continued to flow into the northern ports, and the White House pantry was well stocked. The family's tea service that night was a modest set of white china with gilt edges, not the grand silver service used for state dinners. Mary took her tea with sugar and a splash of milk. Lincoln almost never touched it. But the pot was brought out anyway, as it always was, a small daily ritual of domestic order in a house that had not known real peace for 4 long years. Number 17. Sweet milk, cold from the cellar, filled a glass pitcher at the end of the table. This was milk that had been set that morning, skimmed of its cream, and poured into a stoneware jug lowered into the well to chill. There was no ice delivery that day, only the coolness of deep stone. Lincoln loved sweet milk. Staff remembered him pouring it over cornbread in a bowl, a childhood habit he never abandoned, even in the mansion. That evening, the pitcher was full, sweating slightly in the warm dining room, and a glass was set beside the president's plate. It was the humblest drink in the house, and it was almost certainly the one he reached for first. Number 16. Currant jelly, dark red and trembling, sat in a small cut glass dish near the breadbasket. The White House pantry had put up dozens of jars the previous summer from currants grown in the kitchen garden and shipped in from upstate New York. Jelly was considered essential at every table in 1865, spread on bread, spooned alongside roast meat, or melted into pan sauces. Currant jelly in particular was prized for its sharp sweetness and ruby color, a small flash of brightness against the browns and whites of a typical supper plate. Mary Todd Lincoln was especially fond of it, and the kitchen maintained a steady supply at her request. That small glass dish of jelly, winking in the gaslight, was one of the more elegant touches of an otherwise plain family meal. Number 15. Baked beans, slow-cooked overnight in a heavy earthenware crock, had become a Washington kitchen staple during the war years. The recipe came from New England, where Union soldiers had carried it into mess tents across the South. Navy beans were soaked overnight, layered with salt pork, a chopped onion, molasses, and dry mustard, then buried in a low oven for 12 hours. By supper time on April 14th, a crock of beans sat steaming on a trivet, the pork on top glazed almost black. Lincoln, who had grown up on simple frontier food, loved a plate of baked beans, and the kitchen prepared them at least once a week. A ladleful beside roast meat stretched the meal and filled hungry bellies. It was soldiers' food served at a president's table, a quiet reminder of the war still being fought. Mashed potatoes, whipped with cream and butter, filled a covered silver dish on the sideboard. Potatoes were the workhorse of the White House kitchen in 1865, stored by the barrel in the cellar and pulled up daily for boiling, roasting, or mashing. The cook used a heavy wooden masher and worked the potatoes until they were smooth as custard, folding in cream just before serving to keep them fluffy. A generous knob of butter was pressed into the center, where it slowly melted into a golden well. On the night of April 14th, the potatoes were perfectly seasoned, lightly peppered and steaming hot. They were the kind of dish that did not demand attention, that anchored the plate while the conversation turned to Robert's safe return from the front and the quiet talk of peace. Number 13. Buttered carrots, soft and bright orange, rounded out the vegetable course. The carrots had been pulled from the root cellar that morning, survivors of the previous autumn's harvest, stored in boxes of damp sand to keep them firm through winter. The cook scraped them clean, sliced them into rounds, and boiled them with a pinch of salt until they yielded to a fork. They were drained and tossed with butter and a shake of chopped parsley from the garden, and they came to the table in a simple white dish. Carrots were considered a cheerful vegetable. The color alone said spring was finally coming. They were not a dish anyone wrote home about, but they were on the Lincoln table that night, and they were one of the last simple pleasures of a simple family supper. If you want a full collection, I made a cookbook with 100 simple meals. The link is below this video. Now let's keep going. Number 12. Cabbage, simmered slowly with a piece of salt pork, filled a deep dish at the center of the table. Cabbage was the winter vegetable of the 19th century American household, stored in root cellars by the hundred and pulled out through the long, cold months until the first garden greens returned. The cook that day quartered a pale green head, dropped it into a pot with a chunk of cured pork, and let it simmer for 2 hours until the leaves turned silky and absorbed the salty, smoky flavor of the meat. The smell was not elegant. It filled the kitchen corridor and drifted into the dining room. But Lincoln, raised on pioneer food, had no objection to the honest smell of cabbage and pork. A plate of it, steaming beside his chicken and potatoes, was home cooking of the plainest kind. Number 11. Roast chicken, browned and glistening, rested on a large oval platter in the middle of the table. Two birds, plucked and dressed that morning, had turned slowly on a spit in front of the kitchen fire, basted every 15 minutes with a mixture of butter and pan drippings. The skin crackled golden, and the juices ran clear into a waiting pan to be spooned later over the carved meat. Roast chicken in 1865 was not the everyday dish it is today. A good fat chicken cost real money, and two of them on one table signaled that the evening was something a little special. Mary Todd Lincoln had ordered them up deliberately, perhaps thinking ahead to the theater outing. They were carved at the table by the butler. White meat to the president, dark to the younger son, Tad, who sat beside him. Number 10. Baked Virginia ham, studded with cloves and glazed with brown sugar, sat on a cutting board near the chicken. A whole country ham had been hanging in the White House smokehouse since before Christmas, slowly curing in hickory smoke until the outside turned mahogany dark. That morning, the cook had soaked it overnight to draw out some of the salt, then baked it for 6 hours with a glaze of brown sugar and mustard. The fat cap was scored in diamonds, with a whole clove pressed into each corner. By evening, the ham was carved into thin pink slices and arranged on a platter with curled parsley. Ham was the celebration meat of the Civil War era, served at weddings, Easter dinners, and state receptions. That it appeared on the Lincoln table on Good Friday, April 14th, tells you something about the quiet, hopeful mood in the mansion that night. Number 9. Chicken fricassee, cream-sauced and fragrant, was the president's confirmed favorite dish. White House staff left consistent accounts over the years. When Lincoln was asked what he wanted for supper, he answered chicken fricassee with biscuits, and he answered it often. The cook would simmer cut pieces of chicken with onion, thyme, and bay in a white broth, then thicken the liquid with a roux of butter and flour, and finish it with a splash of cream and a squeeze of lemon. The result was tender meat in a silky, pale sauce, served over biscuits that soaked up every drop. Staff recalled that the president ate fricassee with more enthusiasm than any other food. On April 14th, a covered tureen of it sat on the table beside the roast meats. It was the dish that tasted most like home to him. Number 8. Biscuits, high and flaky, came out of the oven just minutes before supper was called. The cook worked the dough quickly and lightly, cutting in cold lard with 2 knives before adding buttermilk and rolling the whole thing out on a floured board. Cut with the rim of a drinking glass, the rounds went into the hottest oven in the kitchen and puffed up within 10 minutes. A basket of them, wrapped in a white cloth to keep the heat in, was set beside the chicken fricassee. Lincoln was known to split a hot biscuit with his fingers, lay it open on his plate, and ladle chicken and gravy over it until the biscuit disappeared beneath the sauce. It was a gesture of pure, unhurried pleasure. Those biscuits were among the last foods he ever ate. Number 7. Oyster stew, creamy and rich, was offered as a first course in a covered silver tureen. Oysters were the great food obsession of 19th century America. They were cheap, abundant, pulled by the wagon load from Chesapeake Bay, and shipped into Washington packed in barrels of ice. Every White House kitchen of the era kept oysters on hand, and Lincoln loved them. The cook made the stew simply: butter in a pan, a little flour, milk and cream warmed through, a pinch of mace, and the oysters dropped in at the very end so they just began to curl at the edges. Served in shallow bowls with a sprinkle of cracker crumbs on top, oyster stew was considered a food of comfort, warmth, and refinement. It was the elegant opening note of the supper that night. Scalloped oysters were baked golden brown in a shallow dish, and they followed the stew as a heartier oyster preparation. The cook layered shucked oysters with buttered cracker crumbs, cream, black pepper, and tiny bits of butter, then slid the dish into a hot oven until the top turned crisp and the oysters inside plumped up in their own liquor. Scalloped oysters were a party food in 1865, often served at state dinners and elaborate family meals alike. The combination of salty oyster brine, toasted crumb, and warm cream was considered one of the finer pleasures of the American table. On a Friday evening in April, with the family planning to leave for the theater by 8, a dish of scalloped oysters was exactly the kind of refined but unfussy food Mary Todd Lincoln would have ordered for her husband. Number 5. Beef tongue, pressed and thinly sliced, appeared on a smaller platter as part of the cold meat selection. Tongue was prized in the 19th century for its delicate texture and rich flavor, and it was a standard element of White House suppers. The preparation took days. The tongue was first brined in a salt solution for nearly a week, then simmered for hours with onion, bay, and cloves until fork tender. The tough outer skin was peeled off while the meat was still warm. Then the tongue was pressed under a weight overnight to firm up before slicing. On April 14th, those thin pink slices were fanned out with a little mustard and a few cornichons. It was a dish designed to be eaten cold, and it served as a perfect accompaniment to the hot roasts at the other end of the table. Number 4. Canned peaches in heavy sugar syrup appeared in a small cut-glass bowl as a touch of genuine luxury. Commercial canning was still a young industry in 1865, but the Civil War had accelerated its growth dramatically, with union contracts driving improvements in the process. White House pantry records from the period show regular shipments of canned fruit, and peaches were the most coveted of all. Out-of-season peaches in April, sweet and golden in their syrup, were the sort of small miracle that still startled diners. They were eaten with a spoon, straight from the dish, or spooned alongside pound cake. For a family that had lived through the dark winters of the war, a bowl of summer peaches in April was a small promise that better days were coming. Number 3. Terrapin stew, the great delicacy of 19th century American cuisine, simmered in a covered dish on the sideboard. Diamondback terrapin, a small turtle from the Chesapeake salt marshes, was considered the most luxurious ingredient in the country. A single terrapin cost more than most workers earned in a day, and it was the signature dish of every major Washington dinner of the era. The meat was parboiled, picked carefully from the shell, then simmered with sherry, cream, butter, and a little lemon. The resulting stew was pale, rich, and intensely flavored. Whether Lincoln himself cared for terrapin is debatable. He was not a man drawn to fancy food. But Mary Todd Lincoln loved elegant dining, and the kitchen records suggest terrapin was on the table that night as the supper's quiet centerpiece of refinement. Number 2. Pound cake, dense and buttery, sat on a glass cake stand as the evening's dessert. The recipe was centuries old and almost comically simple. 1 pound of butter, 1 pound of sugar, 1 pound of flour, 1 pound of eggs, beaten by hand for what felt like an eternity until the batter was pale and creamy. Baked in a deep loaf tin, it emerged golden, fragrant, and sturdy enough to slice into thick wedges. The White House kitchen made pound cake weekly, and it was served plain, dusted with sugar, or topped with stewed fruit. On April 14th, slices were arranged on a plate beside the bowl of canned peaches. Lincoln, who had a modest sweet tooth, would often take a thin piece after supper. It was a homely, unpretentious dessert, and it closed the meal gently. If you want a full collection, I made a cookbook with 100 simple meals. The link is in the description below. And finally, in first place, number 1, A cup of strong, sweetened coffee, stirred but barely touched, sat cooling beside the president's place when he rose to leave for the theater. Several accounts from White House staff in the days after the assassination describe the president taking only a few sips of his after-supper coffee before checking the time, rising, and asking Mary if she was ready. The coffee had been poured fresh from the pot on the sideboard. Sugar had been stirred in. Cream had been added. Lincoln had raised it to his lips, put it back down, and turned his attention to the carriage waiting at the north portico. That small white cup, half full, was cleared from the table after the family left. The cook later recalled that the coffee was still warm when she carried it back to the kitchen. By the time she had washed the dishes and banked the stove, shots had been fired at Ford's Theater, and the President of the United States was dying in a boarding house across the street. That unfinished cup of coffee became, in the minds of those who remembered it, the smallest and saddest artifact of a supper that ended too soon. It was the last thing he tasted in the house he had called home for 4 long years. Across all 25 foods, from the plain cornbread that opened the meal to the unfinished cup of coffee that closed it, the supper served in the White House on the night of April 14, 1865, tells a story far bigger than any single dish. It was a meal that blended the frontier kitchen of Kentucky with the refined parlors of Washington, a table that carried both the soldiers' baked beans and the senator's terrapin stew, both the child's sweet milk and the wartime president's bitter black coffee. These foods were ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. They fed a family on the verge of peace, a few hours before everything changed forever. Every dish on that table was a small thread in the fabric of a country still at war with itself. And every dish tells us, in its own quiet way, what kind of house Lincoln lived in, what kind of man he was, and what kind of ordinary evening was stolen when the shots rang out at Ford's Theater.